Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. All right, let me grab this clicker over here. Okay. Thank you so much for having me. Hello, I'm Y-Vonne Hutchinson. That is a very large version of my face. And this is my bio. Not a lot of it's incredibly important. I think the one thing to take away from this is, yes, I'm the CEO of a diversity solutions firm called Ready Set. And for most of my professional career, I've been thinking about how to advocate for the rights of the marginalized. And today, I really look closely at the right to access high opportunity employment, or as we like to say, diversity and inclusion. When I first started my company, I used to get a lot of questions. They would be questions like, Y-Vonne, we're really passionate about D&I, that's diversity and inclusion, we just don't know where to start. Or, Y-Vonne, what are some of the best practices that we can do? So in 2016, along with some amazing women, I co-founded an organization called Project Include. And we launched with a handbook of 87 recommendations in the following categories for companies that wanted to increase diversity and inclusion. So 87 recommendations, open source, comprehensive handbook. And then I started to get different questions. And those questions were things like, Y-Vonne, what are the top 3 things I can do to increase diversity and inclusion? Y-Vonne, if I had to do just like one thing to increase diversity and inclusion, what can I do? And I don't like answering that question, because diversity and inclusion can be really complicated. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. But over time, I have softened in my ways. I've gotten a little bit more older, a little bit more mature. I've started to listen to the executives that are screaming in my ear nicely. And so without further ado, I want to introduce the top 10 things that you can do to increase diversity and inclusion in your organization. But not yet. First, I want to level set for a second and answer the question, what is diversity and inclusion? What do we mean when we say diversity and inclusion? In reality, especially diversity, that term could mean anything. You could have a bunch of 40-year-old guys in a room with blonde hair and blue eyes and have one redhead, and all of a sudden you have a diverse group, right? Diversity just basically means some difference in a group. And so I think particularly here it's important to level set, because when I talk to global audiences, it eventually emerges that diversity and inclusion is contextual, and the challenges that we face differ across contexts. And so today I want to level set with a few global challenges that we see in the world of work. And these are challenges we see in the US, yes, but we also see them in Europe, to a lesser extent in Latin America and in Asia. And I think this is where we're going to be grounding our definition of diversity and inclusion. The first challenge we see: women struggle to get hired and to advance. That was something that was mentioned in the intro. It's certainly true across the world. According to the ILO, in terms of workforce participation, only 49% of women participate in the workforce, while 75% of men do, although most women would like to participate. And of course, we're not just talking about participation. When it comes to leadership, we also know that women are underrepresented. In fact, in 2018, the US lost 25% of its female CEOs in the Fortune 500 companies. So we're actually seeing some declines and some rollbacks. We also know that across contexts, ethnic minority groups struggle to get hired and to advance. So in the UK, for example, the unemployment rate for minorities is twice that of whites. And we also know that 30% of blacks, Asians, and other ethnic minorities in the group report witnessing or experiencing some form of racial harassment. So we see that cross-culturally. We also know that those with disabilities struggle to advance and to get hired. So again, in the UK, we see a 30% gap between those with disabilities and those that don't have them in terms of who gets employed. And we know that that gap has remained about the same for almost a decade. So we've seen very little progress there. Finally, there are some global trends I think it's important to call out, right? We know that the world is changing, and it's not just about some of these innate identity characteristics. There's social economic issues as well. And so we know it's becoming more difficult to access higher education. So when we think about the kind of requirements we have for employment, that becomes very important. We also know economic mobility is decreasing and inequality is increasing. And the private sector and our companies can entrench these trends, or they can take the lead in fighting them. So that's what we're going to ground our definition of diversity and inclusion in, those cheery facts up there. And so without further ado, the top 10 things you can do to increase diversity and inclusion in your organization. Number one, don't just focus on women. I know particularly in the global context, this is common for quite a few reasons. In Europe, one of the reasons it's so common is because it's really hard to track numbers for other groups. But as I've just said, there are a lot of groups who are getting left out. So it's super important that we take a holistic view when it comes to increasing diversity and inclusion. One that thinks about religion, physical ability, age. In California, for example, we have more age discrimination lawsuits than we do race discrimination lawsuits. Sexual preference, gender diversity, right? So not just women, but non-binary folks, trans folks, as we sort of build out the circle of inclusion. Otherwise we're just kind of increasing, otherwise we're opening the door a little bit, but we're still excluding folks. Also, connect your approach to diversity and inclusion to your values and your business strategy. I think this is really important. We see this tension in the field between the ethical case for diversity and the business case. And there are folks on both sides of the camp. I'm firmly in the business case side of the camp, and that's because, especially with our clients, my clients, what I see is that so often diversity and inclusion can get prioritized if it's just thought of as something nice to have. So, for example, say you're in a technology company, you've just gotten a round of investment, and you're getting a lot of pressure to grow fast. Well, it's hard for your recruiters to participate in the extended hiring cycle that might be required to get somebody outside of your social networks to justify that if diversity and inclusion is just a nice-to-have thing. However, if you're framing it in terms of your product or in terms of your marketing and the communities you want to reach, it's a little bit easier to justify as a priority. So I always advocate that you tie diversity and inclusion to your business and your values. Develop a strategy and devote resources. In my experience, this is where organizations fail. A lot of times you see ad hoc initiatives sort of spearheaded in a grassroots way, a lot of times by people from the marginalized groups themselves. And what happens is those initiatives aren't cohesive, they don't have a lot of resources, they fizzle out over time. The people who are leading them face this sort of dual pressure, this expectation that they're going to advocate for diversity and inclusion, while also facing a higher level of scrutiny and being pressured to doing their real jobs. And so a lot of folks get disillusioned. And I can't tell you how many times I get an email or a phone call saying, yeah, we started our diversity and inclusion work in 2015. We had some brown bag lunches, we had a D&I committee, and then around 2016, it just sort of stopped, right? And that was because there wasn't any real momentum or cohesive strategy behind it, and the people who were really trying to push for it got tired, and that's understandable. And so those are sort of the high-level recommendations I have, but I also have some tactical recommendations. So when we think about the employee lifecycle, I think that there are a couple of specific things we can do to increase diversity and inclusion in our companies. And quite often the thing that everybody asks me about is hiring and sourcing. Like, where do we find this diverse talent? Where's that magical pool of people that nobody else has really found that can come work for our company? And the advice I give them is to think about sourcing and hiring in terms of relationships. So quite often, you get the feeling that people think that when they're focusing on diversity and inclusion and hiring, that they're doing their candidates a favor. And they don't quite realize that people from underrepresented groups have their own risk calculus when they're going into organizations. They've invested a lot in themselves, and they want to know that wherever they go, they can succeed. So they're not just going to trust off the bat that any company that approaches them is going to be the right company. And they're much less likely to sort of cold contact a company that they've never heard of for a job. So relationships here are really, really important. And I really encourage companies to really think about, what does your relationship strategy look like? What does it look like to build your own pipeline of talent? What does it look like to invest in communities and have them know who you are? That can be very important. But sourcing aside, it's also important to standardize your interview process and train your interviewers. This is critical whether or not you care about diversity. If you care about quality and getting great people in the door, you want to do this. And it may seem like it's something that folks should already know, but I can't tell you how many organizations, particularly early stage startups I go in, where the interview process is something that's done on an ad hoc basis. And when that happens, it's really easy for folks' gut to come into play. And we know we have biases. We are biased towards people who remind us of ourselves, who are in our in-groups. And those biases come out in the interview process. And structure can help buttress against them. But that being said, even with the most structured interview process and candidate evaluation process, you can still see bias creep in because humans run it. So think about some of those resume blinding applications you see. You know, those have limited effectiveness because at the end of the day, one human still has to come face to face with another human, and when they do, there's a risk that their bias can affect that interaction. And so you want to train your interviewers, you want to train the people who are working with these tools, with these technologies, and who are doing the hiring themselves to understand what their biases are and to know how to mitigate them when they're in the hiring process. You also want to bring in diversity at all levels. So quite often I see organizations that really just sort of focus on the entry level. They do all the things that I just mentioned, and they hire, everyone, right out of college or 2 or 3 years, in their professional careers, and they don't have a diverse manager cohort. They don't have diversity at the executive levels, and they lose a lot of that diversity that they've invested in within a year or two, right? And that's because, people realize that they're going to hit a ceiling. I'm writing a book about the future of work, and I was interviewing a woman in technology about the discrimination she faced, and she said, Y-Vonne, it sort of felt like my career went in waves. And I would get to this point, like I'd work really hard, I'd be really enthusiastic, I'd get to this point, and then I just face this downward pressure. Like I could feel the glass ceiling. I could feel people pushing me down and putting me in my place. And it happened every time I got just visible enough, and every time I was a threat. Every time I was real competition. And one way to hedge against that is getting that diversity in at all levels so that people who are underrepresented aren't necessarily seen as a threat and can see themselves at all levels in your organization. And that also brings added benefits too. Those people can bring in their networks and make it a lot easier for you to do recruiting and so forth. 7. Investing in professional development opportunities and building transparency around them. So in the US, we have an attrition rate of about 50% for women in technology. And one of the biggest drivers of attrition that we see is a lack of transparency around growth opportunities. So women, people of color are getting hired, they're coming into organizations, and then they don't know how to succeed. And then they see their peers doing better than them, and they realize, okay, well, there's not really a lot I can do. Nobody's really telling me what I need to do to get to the next level, and they leave. And this is really, really common. And sometimes organizations will say things like, we're really flat, we don't have a hierarchy. I actually don't believe flat organizations don't have a hierarchy. It's just the hierarchy is invisible and informal, and it privileges those who are sort of in the in-group. Or people will say, hey, we want folks to take charge of their professional development, which again, privileges folks that are in the in-group. So it's super important to create transparency around this so you're growing people and creating an environment of inclusion and not just focused on hiring folks. Train your managers. I think this is huge. Quite often, especially in technology, people are promoted on the basis of their technical acumen and not their people management skills. And so they go into these roles not knowing how to manage folks, and they rely on their gut. And I like to say your gut is where your bias lives. And so even if you're not training them on D&I, just training folks on how to manage other people, how to communicate, can have a real impact on the sort of levels of inclusion and engagement that you see in your organization. And moving towards creating accountability around these things, measurement. Every now and then, I know that sounds like a ton of fun, it is, run an audit, right? So look at your hiring, look at who's getting hired, who's entering your hiring pipeline, and then who's getting brought on board and where people are dropping off. Look at pay. Where's your pay equity at? What are the disparities? And cross-cut that. Don't just look at gender, but look at other markers as well. Look at who's getting promoted, and look at who's leaving, right? So that you have a holistic picture of what's happening in your organization. And track engagement of your employees and cut that engagement by different demographic groups, right? So just constantly measure, 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 because you're going to want to collect that data and use that data to create benchmarks and accountability around the measures and the programs that you're running. I like to say what you measure matters, right? Data creates transparency, data creates accountability, and it's super important to use it to inform your approach. Because what feels good may not always be what's effective, right? And so we want to go back to the data to make sure that what we're doing works. But in all this, there are some things that you need to keep in mind. The first is that this takes time, right? So you can't just bring up a couple of brown bag lunches, start a special group for the employees in your organization, and maybe reach out to a few universities and think that's going to fundamentally change the nature of your workforce. It's not. In this, we're butting up against years, decades, centuries even, of labor markets designed to exclude people, right? Whether that's on the basis of gender, race, whatever, and they were designed to do that well. The design was fairly robust, and so it takes time to undo it. It also takes money. It takes real investment. So just like you're investing in your products and your marketing, you have to invest in your culture and in your people. There will always be competing priorities. There's no one right time to do this, right? And so you have to make diversity and inclusion a priority. And I think this is really important. The outside will always come in. So especially now more than ever, in this sort of period of political turmoil, social turmoil, that affects your employees, how they show up at work, and the stances that your organization has to take. So just want to acknowledge that. And finally, we're all still trying to get this right. There is no right or wrong answer here. We're in process, and so it's a journey, and we're all learning as we go. So finally, I'll leave you with a quote. If it doesn't challenge you, it doesn't change you. That's a physical fitness quote, but I think it applies here as well. So just keep that in mind as you're doing this work. Thank you very much.